Hello, this is Philip Watts, and for my presentation I'm going to be discussing civil rights and the court cases. Now, as I was sitting down to work on this particular project, I tried to think of what are some common themes that run through all of them. Every single community that has ever had its civil rights abridged in some fashion. Well, I said we have a constitution, and that constitution frames how we write laws at the state and federal level. But what happens if the legislative branch and the executive branch get together, write and sign a law into law that's unconstitutional? Well, in America we have but one real recourse, and that's the judicial system. And you can pick any civil rights movement that you want. They all have important court cases that settle the decision of what rights belong to whom, and it also provides stepping stones for other groups to take that precedent and start to apply it to them. So we're going to look at Latin American court cases, African American court cases, and LGBTQ court cases that all were stepping stones to civil rights. Now, we'll start off with the Latin Americans. And as the title says, we are white also. The first time I heard this argument was in Dr. Young's podcast. And I was like, well, that's amazing. I did not understand or had learned about the three great races: whites, Africans, and Asians. Having lived in Spain for 3 years, I can tell you that in the northeast portion of the state, the Ebro Valley, it is populated by the ancestors of Romans. They are very light-skinned. They invariably have blue or green eyes, blonde hair, or some version all the way down to brown, but you can tell that they are quite Caucasian. I don't know why I never connected those two facts together, but we will start off with Salvatierra versus Del Rio. Now, this was the first class action suit against segregation of Mexicans into schools just for them. Now, this particular court case sided with them and said segregation is okay, but not on race, and especially not inside one of the three categories. Now, the next one, which is Mendez versus Westminster, was unique because it also ruled against segregation by race and agreed with them that that was in fact discrimination, not segregation though. And the court case state that equal cannot be separate. And this particular outcome was used later in Brown v. Board. Now we're going to start talking about this, but first let's take a look. This is Gustavo Garcia, who is a lawyer who was very involved in the early civil rights cases, arguing that we were white and this is discrimination. The image to the right of that is the LULAC Shield, which is the League of United Latin American Citizens, and also the American GI Forum participated quite heavily in these two cases. Now, Delgado versus Bastrop also claimed discrimination but not segregation, and this one defined the use of equal facilities, services, and instruction as being discrimination, i.e. you really couldn't provide those services, and nor should you have done that because they are actually white. Now, Hernandez v. Driscoll, on the other hand, ended de jure segregation in Texas, just flat out dropped it. However, it did say that segregation based on testing was acceptable. You could segregate based on, say, English competency or standardized testing that was applied to all students. Now, this was also a result of lack of progress on Delgado versus Bastrop, because the local education boards were pretty much just ignoring the court ruling. Now we'll move on over to our African American civil rights cases. And the first one you see up there is Plessy v. Ferguson. And this was in 1896, and you go, well, wait a minute. This particular court case did not help civil rights at all. Well, yes, to a degree, it did. This particular court case set up the separate but equal doctrine, which was not really helpful. But it was, however, the very first attempt to protect civil rights. Admittedly, they did it in an extremely ineffective and poor fashion, and it was racist. There is literally no way to have separate but equal anything. The next one down is Korimatsu versus U.S. You go, wait a minute, Korimatsu, that's a Japanese name. You're right. This was the 1944 court case that stated that it was constitutional to collect all the Japanese up and put them into internment camps. You go, wait a minute. That doesn't sound right. But the key thing to this particular case was it invoked the strict scrutiny test for the government on racial discrimination. It then required the government to demonstrate a compelling governmental interest in abridging a civil right. Now, this is very important because this is a critical stepping stone for later on. Now, in Sweat versus Painter and McLaren versus Oklahoma State Regents, this struck down segregation of graduate and law school. It was really, these two court cases were about states trying to set up separate but equal graduate and law schools. Well, this was thrown out because they proved the state did not, could not, and was not ever going to create something that was separate but equal. They didn't have the same level of instruction, number of instructions. The law library was grotesquely small. The staff was not as educated. They didn't have alumni support. I mean, the list goes on. This particular court case was very important in the fact that inside there, the Department of Justice stated in court that it felt that Plessy was unconstitutional. And that rolls us into Brown v. Board of Education, which actually overturned Plessy v. Ferguson because the NACC caught that little DOJ statement and ran with that successfully. Brown v. Board ruled that segregated schools were ipso facto unequal and could never be. This, however, required a second trial to set timelines because, once again, it was ignored. Now, this takes us over to our LGBTQ civil rights cases. Now, these are very recent, well, in the scope of this class, because these were among some of the last civil rights that were in argument. This first one is One Inc. versus Olson. This was the first successful LGBT case and really started it off. And this was all over the Homosexual magazine. Yes, that's the name of the magazine. Was judged by the U.S. Post Office to be obscene, and therefore they would not post them. This case ruled that this material was not, in fact, obscene, and the Post Office was directed to mail them out. And that was the first start that they had. And you will notice there were some other cases important, but those were all in restricting homosexual rights, not improving them. So we won't talk about that. However, if we skip forward to 2003, and I dated these slides because I wanted to show that really huge span of time between when the first successful case was and really the next one was. And in Lawrence v. Texas, that overturned Bowers v. Hardwick, and this pretty much stated that homosexuals in fact do have a right to sexual activity in the privacy of their own home. Now that was really a bellwether case because there were a large number of states that could put you in jail for a considerable amount of time for homosexual activity, which I personally find very strange because then you're going to put them in jail and they're going to suffer a lot of homosexual activity, mostly unwanted. So I found that to be very peculiar. Now, United States versus Windsor, very critical. This one ruled that DOMA was unconstitutional and really helped to begin to define gay marriage. Now, in the same year, Hollingsworth versus Perry overturned California's Proposition 8, which banned gay marriage. Now, this only affected California. However, it set the precedence for the other states. These states then saw the law and the writing was on the wall and the Great Wall came down. Well, this brings me to my conclusion, and hopefully I have demonstrated that there is one common thread that runs through all of these individual groups who have suffered civil rights abuse, and that is we are able to gather satisfaction from the judicial branch. And I must say that the Supreme Court has certainly led the way in civil rights and making our country really what the framers intended but couldn't do all those years ago. So thank you very much for your time. I hope this was pleasing to you. And, well, I also hope that you find it in your kind heart to give me a good grade. I would appreciate that. Thank you very much. Good night.